Hi everyone, I'm Rosie DeSanctis here with none other than Anthony DeCecco. Anthony, we were talking last week about many mentors and influences that you've had in your life. And one of the things that you had said when we spoke on the phone was that everyone should have an army, dead or alive. What does that mean?
Well, it just means that, if you have to defend yourself as a single person, it's a lot tougher. And if you have a group of people, so when they attack, I think, if somebody would come and attack me for what I perceive as being myself, I have a lot of people that they're going to have to attack, not just me. And people that are brighter, smarter, some fictional, but so they're not really attacking me. And I always make a joke like, they don't have a chance because they're not fighting little Anthony that doesn't know anything about the world.
Right, so if you have allies, then you feel like you're
and the brightest
stronger.
and smartest, in my opinion.
So you surround yourself with really good people and then you lead the pack.
Yeah, and it's been said that by more than one person that, one of the big reasons why I've been successful is because of the people that I have around me. And that is true.
Well, that's definitely an asset, and it's good that you have the wherewithal to make really good choices in that arena.
Yeah, it hasn't always been that way, but I would say it's 70-30.
Well, one of the major influences for you has been an author named Richard Bach. You've talked about illusions, you've talked about Jonathan Livingston Seagull. What excerpt from one of his books do you think best parallels to your life?
Well, there's so many in illusions, and people can just look up the Messiah's Handbook or the Savior's Manual, or wherever it's called, quotes from illusions. And I think there's enough there to get through life, whatever there are, 30 quotes. They apply to everything, similar to Khalil Gibran's book, The Prophet, where you could just open it up and it'll be on relationships or on children or on whatever subject. That's how it is with illusions. But then there's also the story, which is between a mentor and a student. So Don Shimoda is the mentor, the teacher, and Richard Bach is the student. And of course, when I was younger, I really saw myself in Richard Bach as the student. And then as I got older, I became Don Shimoda, the teacher. And now I just flip the roles anytime. When I'm learning, I'm Richard Bach. And but there was one story, and Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, maybe could be my favorite film of all time with Robert Redford and Paul Newman. And there's so many good things about it. And in the book, in Illusions, Richard and Don go into the movie theater to see a movie, and Don explains to him that it's just celluloid and it's just not real, just like the life is not real. And they get into some conversation about what you are allowed to do and what you aren't allowed to do. And Don Shimoda says you're allowed to do anything that you want. And Richard Bach says, oh, I agree with you, but it's anything you want as long as it doesn't hurt somebody else. And right at that point, they run into a guy, and he asks Richard if he can suck his blood, because he said that he's going to die if he doesn't suck his blood. And Richard's like, no, you can't. I'm not letting you suck my blood. And he goes, but I'll die. I have to. He goes, if you take one step closer, you're going to be you're going to be in jeopardy. And so then the guy disappears, and Don explains that he brought this guy to life to show him that Richard was going, even though he was going to hurt that person, he was going to do. That guy was saying that if you didn't suck his blood, he was going to die, and Richard still wasn't going to go for it. So they did settle on that you can do anything that you want. And the whole point of that is that we are designing our own lives. That's what we do. So, you know, if you're the one with the camera designing your life, or are you the one that's a victim of things in the world? And I think that's a big difference, and that's one of the lessons that I learned from Illusions.
So where do you stand on that? Now, we've heard Richard's take on it, we've heard Don's take on it, but how do you feel about we can do whatever we want?
Well, I like the theory. I like the theory that you are free to do whatever you want. But with that theory comes a responsibility. So you are free to do whatever you want. I do agree that's true, and we've seen it with a lot of people. But you do have a responsibility that comes with that.
Okay.
So that's all I'll say about it, and it has more to do with like personal philosophies that people have.
Right.
But yeah.
Now, you mentioned Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid as a big theatrical influence for you, and that there were signposts in that movie. What was so impactful?
Well, the thing about that movie is, not to mention that Paul Newman is my favorite actor of all time, at least for my age period. And now I like people like Robert Downey Jr. and Heath Ledger and Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt a lot. And but I really loved Paul Newman and all his movies. And there was the story about Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid was that Joanne Woodward, who's Paul Newman's wife, lobbied for Robert Redford to play the part, and it was going to be Steve McQueen and Robert and Paul Newman, and Steve McQueen wanted equal billing or something, and then actually Paul Newman was going to play Sundance Kid, and you know, he changed it and he became Butch Cassidy, and they got an unknown, Robert Redford, for Sundance Kid, and the rest is history. And George Roy Hill is the director. He was brilliant. And Paul Newman, at the last second, the day of shooting, decided to play Butch Cassidy as a comedian type. So that was another twist to it. Now, by the way, Butch Cassidy's sister was actually on the set. And that story is very close to the truth, that story. Of course, the ending, which is left up in the air about whether they live or die.
Right.
That there's some theories that they lived and traveled, and there's some things that they did die in Bolivia. But for the most part, it's pretty close to the truth. And that's actually what you would consider, and that was 1969, you would consider that the first buddy movie. But in my opinion, it was the respectful buddy movie. Like, these guys loved each other, but they went at each other, and they had like a rapport and a sync, you know, like we do. They had a sync with each other that you couldn't make up, and you can't, like, you know, it's authentic. And they loved each other, and they had so many things they would say, like when they went back to, like, similar when I went back to Coatesville, Paul Newman would go, every time I go back to the hole in a wall, he goes, I ask myself, why am I going back to this place? And then, you know, he has some comments like, you know, he sees his vision's 2020 and the rest of the world's wearing bifocals. And they have these jokes that go back and forth. But at the ending, the poignant scene is when they're eating in Bolivia, and the army attacks, and they have to jump and hide out, and then they have to get their ammunition, and like Paul Newman says, you go get the ammunition, I'll cover for you. And Sundance Kid was the shooter, the skillful one, and Paul Newman was the talker, and he said okay, and then Paul Newman said, nah, you have to go. I mean, I have to go, because you can cover me, I can't cover for you. So he goes, he gets shot up, they both get shot up, they get back in, and Paul Newman says, you call that cover? And Robert Redford says, you call that running? Like, so they have that kind of rapport. And then as they're, like, looks like they're dying, Paul Newman says, I got another idea. And he goes, you're always full of ideas. You know, he's crazy, I don't want to hear it. And he goes, Australia. And he goes, I figured secretly wanted to know. And he's trying to explain to him that Australia is going to be better, right? And Robert Redford thinks he's dying. He's like, don't want to hear a word about it. And he says, what's so good about there? He goes, the banks. He goes, what about the banks? He goes, they're great. He goes, what about the girls? And he goes, they're beautiful. He goes, first you get one and then you get the other. And like he's telling them all this stuff that they taught to him, and it's just sweet the way that they interact with each other. And they have this guy LaForce who's following them, who they're really afraid of, who wears a white hat. And he goes, did you see LaForce out there? And he says, no, I didn't see him out there. He goes, okay, I was worried for a second. And then they come out and end it. And there are a couple other things. Like there's so many things that you can learn from that, like
right.
that I use today. Like a simple one is the bounty, the guy that takes care of the money, the guard for the money, is going to hire them, right? And he says, can you shoot? And he throws this like coin way out there, and Robert Redford shoots, and he misses it. And the guy walks away, and he goes, can I move? And the guy goes, what? And Robert Redford like moves, goes down, shoots it up in the air, and shoots it in half. And he says, I'm better when I move. So like we use that all the time in
right.
tennis. And,
right.
And there's just so many things. There's a lot of comedy. There's Catherine Ross. There's a love interest. I just think if I had to pick one movie that kind of sums everything up, I think it's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And it was funny that it was in Illusions, because I look for those syncs.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, you definitely are always looking for the deeper meaning in things.
Yeah, and the connection.
Now, you also, in addition to that film, you said that there are a lot of TV shows that really influenced you on a much deeper than just an entertainment level. What are the top shows for you?
So I guess we'd have to start with The Honeymooners. And, you know, I always thought that any of my mentors or influences, I would love to teach a college course with just using them as an example, because the people that I like, they seem to have one like philosophy, but it seems to span so many different things. So this idea of personal to the universal is big with me. And you can go either direction. It could be a universal truth that you can make personal, or it's a personal truth that you can then expound and make it universal. And that's the way all of my mentors are. So with The Honeymooners, we have Jackie Gleason, they called the Great One, and I think it's an apt name for him because he's brilliant. And they have Audrey Meadows, who was too pretty for the role of Alice. So she took all her makeup off and wore a ripped dress and came back for a second audition, and that's how she got the part. And then they have Joyce Randolph as Trixie, and then Art Carney
Ralphie boy.
As Ed Norton. and you know, when they asked Jackie Gleason what percentage of the show Art Carney was, he said 80%. And you know, so it was that kind of thing. And they did not have rehearsals during the week. They had a fill-in for Jackie Gleason, and you know, this, similar to our podcast, we don't rehearse, but you know, it does. He did think that he thought that it took away from the spontaneity of it, and they did it in front of a live audience, and I would agree. You know, if you make it too canned, it's not authentic. So, you know, I was happy to hear that. And the other actors would come in and say their lines, and they had somebody stand in for Jackie Gleason.
Would they get to rehearse ahead of time?
Yeah, they rehearsed.
As an actor, that would make me very nervous, because comedy is very contingent on timing. You have to make it look like it's just happening for the first time, but, you know.
Well, the other three rehearsed.
Okay.
All week. And so they would just play off of him, like they could do that. But, yeah, it's the Honeymooners, 39 episodes, and there's a lesson in every episode, and it covers everything from friendship to relationships to work, to husband-wife relationships, to you know, schemes. He always has a scheme. He's always looking to strike it rich. Money, mother-in-laws, the mamba dancing. It's all over the place.
What's your favorite episode?
Well, I know my dad always loved the Mamba because what happened was, there was a guy that moved into the apartment complex and he started teaching all the wives how to dance. And Ralph got jealous, as he always would, because this guy had like all the women dancing, and they had Mrs. Manicotti from upstairs, and she was doing a Mamba when Ralph came home.
I never saw that one.
And he goes, he goes, you at your age should be embarrassed or something, and like kicks her out. But he said, Alice goes, everybody does them. He said, you said everybody. He goes, my mother doesn't do the Mamba or something like this. But anyway, my dad always liked that one. And I like, they call it, I think they may call it Young Man with a Horn. And I call this episode Hit the High Note. And so the idea is Alice is cleaning out some trash and she has but the funny thing is they call it Young Man with a Horn. Norton calls it a cornet. Ralph calls it a bugle. Like, they got a different name for everything. And I actually think it's a trumpet is what it is. It starts out with Alice taking out some trash to give away to Goodwill or put away and put in the trash. And Ralph gets upset because his bugle or cornet or trumpet is there. And he said he used to play it, and he goes, it's it symbolizes the story of his life, always starting something and never finishing something. So he tries to play it, and he goes, that's the story. I can never hit that high note. And so there's a knock on the door, and an older couple comes in, and they say, can we look around? We used to live here. This was our first house. And Ralph invites him in, and it ends up being a famous donut magnet, makes donuts. And Ralph recognizes him, and he says, listen, I want to ask you, he says, how did you make a success of your life? And he said, and the old guy said, I envy you. I envy the young. You have your whole life ahead of you. He goes, what I did is I made a list of my good points and a list of my bad points. And I tried to enhance the good points and get rid of the bad points. And the funny thing is we make this joke all the time, with people about like, getting rid of the bad points and the good points. And I mean, I've personally done it myself. So Art Carney and Jackie Gleason sit down, Ed and Ralph, and they get a piece of paper, and he hands the paper to Norton, and he says, why don't you put my bad points? He goes, and I'll write the good points. And so Ralph can't get started, and Norton says, what's the matter? Why can't you get started? And Ralph's like, I have so many good points, I don't know where to begin, right? And Norton starts writing like a mile a minute. Okay, he's got like a long list, and Ralph grabs the paper and he's like, what are you doing here? He goes, okay, rotten pool player, rotten bowler, can't speak French. And he goes, doesn't pay his debts. And he goes, what are you talking about, doesn't pay his debts? And he goes, yeah, you owe me $2 for like a month now. And he takes out the $2, and Norton's like, I knew that would work. And he starts scratching out number 4. And he goes, that's stupid. Ralph says, you're not supposed to be writing stuff down like can't speak French. He goes, okay, let's look at the other way. He goes, Norton says, let me do your good points and you do your bad points. So Norton takes a piece of paper, writes for 5 seconds, and folds it and puts it down. And Ralph's like, what are you doing? And he goes, it took you half an hour writing the bad stuff. He goes, now it took you 2 seconds. And he reads it. He goes, sweetest guy in the world. So, because they really are friends. And he goes, and Norton says, see, I'm trying to help you here. See, that's why I put. So they put it on the board, and so that he can look at it every day, and he's got like things like treats wife like workhorse, and he's got his one good point, sweetest guy in the world, and he got all this other stuff. And he goes, I think he comes home from work and he says, I was practicing number like 15 today or something, where it said, where I don't get mad at people. He goes, somebody at work said there were like, 4 million people in New York. And he goes, and I know there are 3 people in New York, but I didn't fight with them about it. And Alice goes, there are 4 people. And he starts going, you don't know what you're talking about. So he misses the boat again with the bad points, but he's working on it. He's doing better. So they go through the whole thing, and as we get toward the end of the episode, the point is Ralph is going to try to make a better life for himself, and so he takes a civil service test, and Norton takes a civil service test, and Norton works in a sewer. So they're like taking a test and dreaming about how they're going to be running the city, Ralph up top and Norton down the bottom. And they take the test, and then the next scene, Ralph comes home and Alice says, did you get the results in the paper for the test? And he goes, no, I'm not worried about it though. Ralph's always like, he's like, I'm not worried about it. He goes, now I'm worried about Norton, because Norton, one of the questions said if gas was 5 cents and it went up to 7 cents, and oil was like 7 cents and it went up to 9 cents, what would you do? And Norton said, pack up and move to Florida. He goes, so I'm worried about him. So anyway, he goes into the bedroom, and then Norton comes in, and he's looking neglected, and he said, and Alice says, you didn't pass the test. He goes, no, I didn't pass the test. And he goes, what about Ralph? And he goes, you think I'd be feeling this bad just for myself?
Aww.
And so Ralph comes out, and Norton, says there are 2 hangnails on the fickle finger of fate. And he goes upstairs, and now they're left together. And, Ralph, who was trying to do all these, get himself better and get rid of his bad points, has failed once again. And so he sits down at the table, and Alice is behind him, and she says, this new Ralph is a great person, and I don't want to ever see the old person around here ever again. And she sticks up for him, even though he failed. And so he says, Jackie Gleason, Ralph Cramden says, I did hit the high notes once, and that's when I married you. And then he plays the bugle, and he gets a little piece of it. So I always thought, and they end a lot of times with "Baby, you're the greatest."
Right.
And I remember the initial episode where Audrey Meadows was not his wife. It was very like Ralph fought with the wife a lot and stuff. But this one always ends the right way with "Baby, you're the greatest" or whatever, even if they have their clashes.
They reconcile it somehow.
So and they have. So what we do is we reference every day, almost every day we reference the Honeymooners. And my dad loved the Honeymooners, and a good friend of mine, Steve and Denise Peretti, are like real life Honeymooners.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And they bring it up all the time, because there's one episode about Mrs. Wiedemeyer. And she's like the really good-looking trophy wife, let's call it. And I don't mean to say trophy wife; it might be a girlfriend, whatever. But I remember we were at a party with a couple of guys that were the professional lacrosse players, and the one had a really cute girl, and she walked in. We were in like a little widow's peak, just having a little party, and she walked in, and it was in the show. They're like, Mrs. Wiedemeyer, charmed. Like, so we would use that line, like, and then people would be like, what are you talking about? Like, her name's not Mrs. Wiedemeyer, but we do. Right. So anyway, we've referenced this so much, and we see it every day, we look for it.
Right, that's great when you have things like that you can kind of apply for poignancy in your life, but also for fun, Now, So while Anthony was answering that wonderful question, we had a little bit of a natural disaster come through.
So it's good.
Okay, do we need to get rid of this? But we're all okay. Anthony's okay. No one got hurt. So we have to acknowledge that there was a piece of plexiglass and now it's gone. And we're just going to keep going like it didn't happen. Now, the next show, All in the Family, that's a groundbreaking show.
Yeah, now the thing about All in the Family is you probably couldn't make that today with all of the, injustices and tension. But the thing that's brilliant about it is Norman Lear wrote it. He did a lot of good stuff, brilliant stuff. And the other thing is Carroll O'Connor, who plays Archie Bunker. He's the furthest thing from the character that you'll ever find, as is Jackie Gleason, the furthest
Right.
from Ralph Cramden. This guy is like unbelievably successful, and Ralph fails at every turn. And Carroll O'Connor is the most flexible, soft-spoken, intellectual, educated person in the world, and Archie Bunker isn't.
Right.
But he'd be the perfect one to play the part. And Norman Lear said that they talked about every single bias, racism, anything, bigotry. They talked about everyone, and everything was on that show. You know, menopause, transgender. They tackled every tough issue. And at the beginning, they had to have a disclaimer, say that it wasn't the views of the network, because it was so crazy, but it took off and it was a #1 show.
It really, there was nothing like it. I mean, I remember watching that show. I mean, it's still on in syndication, and being like, oh, I can't believe they just said that, you know? Like, really, and that was multiple times an episode.
Oh,
He
yeah.
would just say these things. But, you know, if you were to look at it from a network standpoint, you're like, there's no way, this show's never gonna work, the people are gonna hate the show. But what it did was really shine a light on bigotry and racism, and how, wow, do we really have these narrow opinions, and you got to really see how it doesn't make sense, and in a way that wasn't preachy.
Well, Norman Lear also said that everybody knew an Archie Bunker, so it wasn't like there was one Archie Bunker.
Do you?
Yeah, oh yeah, more than one, right? But and it's also they have half a dozen spin-offs from that show, so it's not like it was made. It's high quality. You had Edith, right? She's Maureen Stapleton. She's
Loved
like
her.
crazy.
Loved her.
Good. You have Carroll O'Connor, like we said. You have Rob Reiner, who was absolutely brilliant. His father, Carl Reiner. These guys are brilliant people. Rob Reiner went on to become an unbelievable director.
Yeah.
And,
Princess Bride, one of my favorite
Yeah.
movies.
And Sally Struthers, she was brilliant. So you had the four people again that played their roles, and you had the interaction between them that made it unbelievable. And they had so many great episodes.
And George Jefferson and
Yeah,
Louise,
the
and then even
Jeffersons.
B. Arthur in Maude.
Maud, you had Barney next door. Yeah, you had everybody.
Yeah.
That was a funny one. It was when Archie ran over Barney's dog. And Barney came to the door and he's like, you know, where's my dog or something like that. And Archie's like, Archie didn't like him because the dog kept pooping on the stoop. And what he did is he accidentally ran him over, but he only broke his leg and he took him to the hospital. But Barney doesn't notice, and he's like, where's my dog? And Archie's like, you know, it'd be terrible like when your dog's out running around if he got like run over by a car. And Barney's
my
like, don't
God.
say he got run over by a car. He goes, no, you know, probably be better like if he had just like a fracture, right? And Barney's like, well, yeah, it would be better if he had a fracture. And he goes, you know, probably costs like, you know, $15, $20. And Barney goes, you run over my dog. And Archie's like, he's like, Barney, it was an accident. He goes, in fact, I rushed him right to the hospital. I almost clipped 2 more dogs on the way. So that like, but we used to count the jokes. There were so many of them, you know, and then that doesn't even count the ones that are the hard hitters, that
Right.
which would bring us to the episode with Sammy Davis Jr., who left his bag in Archie's car, and
His cab. He was a
in
cab
a cab,
driver?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, right. Archie was a cab driver, moonlighted as a cab driver, and you know, Archie was trying to tell the family who it was, and he was making some racial thing, and Mike knows him so well that he's like Sammy Davis Jr., right? So he knows exactly what the guy's saying, even though he's describing it in a racist way. And so they get Sammy Davis Jr. calls up and he says, can I come over to the house and pick it up? So that brings all the neighbors over, and they have a stage mom who has a kid that dances, and they bring a floor in. And everybody's going crazy, right? And Archie goes, and Archie's famous, for people that don't know, for his chair. It's in the Smithsonian Institute. And nobody sits in his chair. Nobody, not the meathead, nobody sits in a chair. So Sammy Davis Jr. comes over, and Archie says, don't say anything about his eye, because Sammy Davis Jr. has a glass eye. Don't say anything about his eye. So he comes in, and Sammy Davis sits in his chair, and Mike makes fun of him, and Archie for him sitting in his chair. And he's like, Archie, oh, Mr. Davis can sit in my chair. He's like the only one, so he's sitting in the chair. And Edith brings coffee, and Archie says, would you like some sugar in your eye? You know, like he said. So anyway, they go on, and you know, Edith sits, Archie sits, Sammy Davis sits, they talk to him. You know, Mike and Gloria sit right next to each other, and everybody's so fascinated. And they go on, and Lionel comes over, and they somehow, it's brilliant the way they do it. They somehow, Archie tries to get Sammy Davis Jr. to take his side against the kids, who are like pinkos or leftists or wherever they are, right? And obviously Sammy Davis Jr. is much more enlightened and evolved than, you know, Archie's giving him credit for. And so the way they do it is brilliant. And at the end, you know, Sammy Davis says something that would be code language for the kids, explaining how Archie is who he is. The kids are happy, and Archie is happy because he takes it as a compliment. So he misses the whole boat.
Right.
And then Sammy Davis says, could I have a picture? And they say 1, 2, 3, and he kisses Archie on the cheek, which would have been crazy, right, for Sammy Davis Jr. to be kissing Archie. And it won an Emmy. Won an award. So,
wow.
And that's not the only one. They had so many brilliant episodes.
I'm sure they did.
So that was another influence.
There's something that you don't know about me. I happen to do a great Archie Bunker impersonation.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Let's hear it.
All right. Oh, geez, that meathead. Hi.
That's great. That's awesome.
Not the most attractive thing in the world, but you know,
right.
It's fun. So I do that all the time. Oh, geez, there, hi. So, moving on. Columbo.
So Columbo, for people who don't know, is Peter Falk, and he was a detective, a disheveled detective who was never taken seriously, underestimated, and by everybody, who he eventually put in jail and eventually won against. But the interplay, the psychological interplay, was so good. And for me, it's the kind of thing where, in fact, just the other day we were doing a refinance for the club, and I came out of the gym, and I, you know, just forgot that the people that were doing the refinancing had never met me, and I'm the one signing all the papers. So I come out and I say hello, and I notice the way they say hello to me, like, you know,
who's this guy?
You're nobody, right? So whatever the thing, and then I went up to the front desk to Jody, and I was like, you know, they don't know that I'm the one that's going to be signing the papers for the refinance, that I'm the owner. So anyway, I went back into my bookkeeper's office, and then they had it, and it was like, I think Bill Gates used to do that. He used to answer the door, and they say, we have an appointment with Bill Gates, and he would say, I'll lead you back, and then he would lead him back in a room and then sit behind the desk.
Then he'd sit down.
Because, you know, but anyway, it was like, I always loved the idea of people not taking Columbo seriously. But they always thought they were smarter than him. They always thought he was a goofball. He smoked cigarettes. I mean, he smoked cigars. And he was always chomping on a cigar. I don't think it was ever lit. And he had a wife that you never met. And he would always make references. He was a lot like my dad, you know, like they would ask him a question. He would go, you know, that reminds me of my wife. And he would tell a story. And so he just like was the kind of character that would fit in perfect in my army. And you know, one of his techniques, and I use this all the time, So he would blindside people. So if I came up and said to you that I had to ask you a question, and I was going to ask you tomorrow, and this was the question, what it was going to be. Well, by the time I got to you tomorrow, my chance of getting an honest answer might be, little to none, because you'd have all this time to think about it and how you wanted to answer it. So what he would do is he would ask all the questions that they knew were coming, and then he would leave, and then they would relax, and then he would come back in and say, oh, I had one more question. And then he would give the question that he really wanted answered the right way. So he was brilliant that way. And my favorite episode is with Leonard Nimoy, Spock from, what was the name of the show?
Star Trek.
Star Trek. I was going to say Star Wars. So Star Trek, and Leonard Nimoy, he was Vulcan, so he had no emotion. So he played the part of a doctor who had no emotion. It was a perfect fit for him. And they had a lot of good villains in that show, famous people, but he was my favorite one. So he was a doctor. What he was trying to do was kill his partner so he could take over the practice. And Columbo figured it out, but he couldn't figure out, what Leonard Nimoy did, in the show, what he did was he put in sutures that were going to disintegrate and the guy would die. But when Columbo figured it out and confronted Spock, let's call him, confronted him, he said, I know you did it, and when he dies, you're going to be up for murder. So now Leonard Nimoy has to figure out how he's going to get the sutures out, save the guy's life so he doesn't get convicted, and all do it in front of Columbo. And Columbo has police, everybody watching him, so he has to give him the wrong medicine, get the guy to get sick, so he has to get rushed in. This is Leonard Nimoy. He has to get the guy sick, to put him into the operating room, to get the sutures out, hide them, and put the other sutures in. So they have cops everywhere, and everybody's watching, and Columbo goes in at the end of it and says, search everybody. So they search everybody. And when he walked in, Columbo was, or Leonard Nimoy was so calm, even when Columbo threatened him by hitting a paperweight on a table and saying he was going to get him for murder. He just stayed so calm. And when Columbo walked in, and they searched everybody, Leonard Nimoy went to his office, and Columbo walked in the office, and he had his gown on from the operating room, and he hung it on a door. And he came in and he said, I got to hand it to you. And I thought this was the first time Columbo was not going to get the guy.
Right.
And that's why I thought it was so brilliant. And he said, I got to hand it to you, Doc. He goes, we searched everybody. I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you got rid of the sutures, but, and he shook hands with him. And he walked out the door, and Leonard Nimoy gives a big sigh of relief. And Columbo comes back in, like he does. And he said, you know what? You almost had me. He goes, when I walked in, he goes, we searched everybody, and we can't find the sutures. He goes, and I can't for the life of me find out where they went. But when I walked in there, you always are calm. You never get upset. But when I walked in, you pushed me. Out of character, he says, the only place we didn't check was my jacket. And he went in and pulled out the suture, so he got him in the end. So that was the best episode, I thought. We always thought it. I think it's called A Stitch in Time. Ah. So it's a good,
Yeah, I heard a rumor that, that character used to kind of do this a lot, and pace.
Yeah.
And I heard, now this could be just like, who knows, but that he would be looking for his mark for the camera.
Oh, yeah, that could be.
So.
Well, I'll tell you the thing that, all of my mentors and influences, there's always the sense of humor. Mm-hmm. They all have them.
Right.
In somewhere or another.
Well, the last one that you had told me about was Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, so Sherlock Holmes is huge for me. I mean, there have been different people that played him. Basil Rathbone, who was the Sheriff of Nottingham in another movie that I really love, Robin Hood. And
I love that movie as well.
Yeah, with Errol Flynn. and Olivia de Havilland, who just passed away.
Yeah, at 104 years old,
Yeah.
she was.
And Basil Rathbone played on TV. He was the first Sherlock Holmes, and he was great. And then the BBC, so Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, for the people that don't know, is the author of Sherlock Holmes, and he put a bunch of people together to make the character. So there was a doctor, part him, part people, and he made him a detective. And so anyway, the BBC adapted his books into a TV program, and they did it to the letter with Jeremy Brett, who was brilliant. And he was brilliant, and he was the best one in my opinion. He just had the peculiar, they caught everything perfectly. And then of course Robert Downey Jr., my son and I are big Sherlock Holmes fans, and we went to the movies and we watched Robert Downey Jr. and he's incredibly awesome.
Yeah.
So and you know, Sherlock Holmes, he's a lot like me. Like he plays a bad violin. Like, you know, I play a bad guitar and sing poorly, but it's what I like to do. And he also, you know, he has the concentration that he can concentrate on one thing. And actually on my Facebook page and also on my grave, which is what I'm asking my son to put on, is he played the game for the sake of the game, which is what is on Sherlock Holmes when he supposedly died in the movie. He played the game for the sake of the game, and that's pretty much sums up, like, you know, he wasn't interested in money. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in the game that they were playing. And Professor Moriarty was his antagonist. And we often say this. The thing that I have respect for with Sherlock Holmes is he would not pick on somebody who wasn't worthy adversary.
Right.
And that's what one of the big things I learned from Sherlock Holmes is that you don't pick on somebody that's not a worthy adversary. If they are in over their head, it's unfair. Pick the person that's a challenge.
Right.
Okay, if they're going to go against you, don't go to the lowest common denominator. So, should I go with my favorite Sherlock Holmes episode? So, with the Sherlock Holmes episode, obviously it has to have Moriarty in it. And the interesting thing was it's called The Final Problem. And, you know, I'm big into good and evil. And, you know, I'm a romantic, so I think good wins out over evil all the time. Hopefully it did in my life. No, but
it appears so.
And so what happens is Moriarty, the beginning of the show starts with Moriarty meeting Sherlock Holmes. Now remember, they've had all these stories and they never met. They've been adversaries.
Right.
They never met face to face.
Right.
And Sherlock Holmes would say, you know, he didn't have as much frontal lobe development as I would have imagined, because they got these ideas, right? Well, Moriarty threatens him and says, you know, if you continue, you know, and they use all the flowery proper English language, you know, pretty much, I'm going to kill you. And Holmes said, well, if I'll forget how he puts it, if I could be sure that you would die, I would gladly accept my death, or something like this. So, because he thinks he has to get rid of him because he's evil, and he does all these things that nobody knows about Scotland Yard, and he does all these things. He has his hand in all over the place for bad stuff that happens. So, anyway, they end up. And the interesting thing is the movies that Robert Downey Jr. did. The second movie that he did tells this story out of all the episodes. And you know, in the end, there was such an uproar that when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle ended it, he had to bring back, so they have a first set of episodes, whatever they are, he had to bring back for 2 more sets, like 38 more and 48 more. There was such an outcry. And to my point about people being fictional, this is a fictional character that he wasn't allowed to kill. They had to bring him back.
Well, you said that once, that quote from Illusions about fiction
could
sometimes
be more real.
Right,
Yeah, it could be
more real than real life.
And so what Moriarty does is he somehow gets Holmes to go to Reichenbach Falls, and And what happens is he sends a letter to Watson to get rid of him, a fake letter saying from Watson's wife that he has to go home. And the funny thing is Holmes knows it all along, of course, because he's so far ahead of the game.
Right, right.
But he knows he has to go because they have to end. And they have a fight, and in the book, they go over the falls, and both of them go, and that's how he ends it. But they have to bring him back again, so they had to figure out a way to bring him back. And in the Robert Downey Jr. one, they tidy it up a little bit. And what happens is Mycroft gave Holmes this little breathing mechanism, and so they go over the falls, and Watson is sitting in his room, and he's typing a letter or something, whatever, and the wife is saying we have to go out to the country, so he goes, okay, dear, and then a box comes. Mrs. Hudson brings in a box, and he opens the box, and the box, all it is the breathing mechanism. And so he leaves, and there's a chair that has a fancy pattern on it, and Isabel always, and Luke would always, I have these pair of pants that have a pattern on it that look like they could be a chair, like with the stripes and like different things. So they call it my Sherlock Holmes pants, because what happened is the whole time Watson is there, Sherlock Holmes is dressed in a onesie that's the same pattern as the chair. So he's sitting there the whole time, but you can't see him.
Oh my gosh.
And Watson, what he was typing was the final problem. He's typing the story because he chronicles it, right? He's the chronicle.
Right.
So he types it and he puts the end, and Robert Downey Jr. walks around and hits the question mark. And next to he puts a question mark. So yeah, and Sherlock Holmes has always been helpful in being able to use my mind and figuring things out.
Yeah, think ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, think ahead.
He's brilliant.
Well, I will say this, Anthony. In real life, you had great parents. And I can say that because in many ways, I feel like we were both blessed with that. I know that your father had the same reverence for your mother that my father had for my mother. Thought she was the most beautiful woman in the world. So how crazy and wonderful was it to have them as your parents?
Well, so, my dad grew up in a house where his father was in charge, and then they made an effort, a conscious effort, to raise us as equals in the house from day one. And what I got with my dad is that he just catered to my mother to the point that we were embarrassed. Because people would be like, she like, go get my pocketbook out of the car, Aunt, go do this, go do that. And he waited on her hand and foot. And you know what? I found out that's not bad. That's not bad at all.
But she appreciated that though, right?
Oh, she did, yeah. They worked for each other. They were a team, and my dad always said that. But in our house, my mother was the most important one. He gave her all the credit. My dad's brilliant. What my dad could do was he could say something that sounded totally ludicrous, but come off authentic. Like he would tell everybody that he belittled the fact that he went and worked and gave us everything and did this. So he had nothing to do with our upbringing at all. It was all my mother. She gets all the credit. She did everything, which is not the total truth, but there was no harm in putting it that way. And I know my friend Steve, he used to do a lot to set up parties at his house, and then he would always do a toast to his wife. And I thought that was sweet. And what's wrong with countries that are run by women, in my opinion? And maybe we have, in my family, and I probably do have an overinflated sense of women, but my grandmother, my mother, I mean, these were important people.
Right.
And my wife now. Like, there's no way I could have done any of this stuff that I've done. Everybody knows that I would be under a bench somewhere, if not for Betsy, like it's common knowledge. Now, if you look at the real story, I've done some things, okay, to help out. But from the outside, everybody says, you know what, I'm good with it too. Because really, the point is, it's like, you know, if with this person, we couldn't have done it. Without me, they may have been able to do it. So the family, you know, and my dad was the same way. Without my mother, we never would have been able to do it. And I didn't learn his importance until later in life when my mom passed away.
How did he handle that?
And he started talking. Well, he went south at the beginning. It was touch and go. He put on a lot of weight. He was in rehab. I didn't think he was going to make it. You know, he always said that he was 100% sure he would go first. He was the one that had all the problems.
Right.
And he thought he would go first. And it didn't work out that way. And you know, we have all these stories. Like my grandmother lived for 35 years after my grandfather died.
Wow.
And my wife's grandmother lived to 106 or 107, like 40 years after her husband died. The women don't seem to have a problem. They just go on, get their church group, get their book club. They're fine, right, without men, which, you know, is maybe another topic for another time. But the women, they seem to be fine. They get together, they like do their thing. And the men are lost. They got to like either bring somebody else in right away to cook and clean and take care of them, or else they suffer like my dad did. And there was, you know, people try to fix my dad up. There was no way that anybody was taking my mom's place.
Right.
And in his head. And so, but the silver lining was I got to know my dad in a way I never knew him before. And, you know, we had the funny things when we were younger. Like he had, we used to go to the beach and he spent a lot of time with us. And you know, he used to talk about play the hand you're dealt, which I know other people have used, but, you know, I say they stole it from him because he was saying it for, you know, a good 50 years
That was
now.
like his motto.
Yeah, play the hand you're dealt. Well, the reason it was his motto is he did it. He lived it. He played the hand he was dealt. Right, he had a tough upbringing, but he didn't let it bother him. He would say things like, for whatever reason I decided to go to college, for whatever reason, you know, like, but whatever. It wasn't like people like pushed him into it. He had his own way of doing it, and he didn't have the help. He didn't have the support. So he played the hand he was dealt then. And when he was in South Philadelphia and he got laid off, you know, he went and got another job eventually, and he struggled while he didn't, but, you know. And then the big one was when he was 56, he got cancer, and I took him to all of his chemotherapy. And at this point, he was plant manager. He was winning awards, running a plant of making catalytic converters. And, you know, the catalytic converter is a device that you put on a car that takes the bad air, gets out the impurities, so that the air, the exhaust that goes into the air doesn't pollute it, which is a great metaphor for my dad because that's what he did. He was given, you know, a tough hand, and he made something out of it. And you know, I'm just trying to, you know, do the best I can to make both of them proud, you know, and make up for all the the things that I did, you know, to put them through hell when I was younger.
Right.
But I, you know, so play the hand you're dealt was huge, and when
But he handled his illness
when he
with
got
a lot of grace.
Yeah, when he got cancer, he got a hairpiece. I would take him on Friday to chemo. He would talk all the way there. On the way home, he would sleep because he was so beat up. Weekend, he would be in bed, and then he'd go to work Monday morning. So he took off every Friday for 8 weeks.
Did they know at work that he was that sick?
See, the thing is, he's not like me. He would have never done a podcast and told his whole story. he was much more humble and close to the vest. He never told anybody. And he was the kind of guy that probably they respected and they didn't ask, but it was obvious. You know, everybody knew. And I remember when I walked around the plant, people were telling me that he saved their lives. He saved their livelihood, their lives, their families, because he made the plant a success. and you know, they only let him take it over when they were struggling. Like, it wasn't like they hired him. You know, it's a company from England, and they notoriously don't put like an American in the top position. But
Right.
as a last resort, they put him in, and he got the company on its feet. And a lot of people said that, and he did it while he had cancer.
Wow.
And so, you know, like, you go around, people always complain, and they're like, you know, like my tennis pros sometimes, they're like complaining, like, I had to work for 8 hours and stuff. And we always laugh because my dad said, listen, if they're not telling you you have cancer, you don't really have anything to complain about.
You're right. That's so true. Do you think you're like your dad, Anthony?
So when I was younger, right, I thought I was like my grandfather, because he was the outgoing one. And, you know, even my dad would say, you're like your grandfather. Like, I don't know how many times I heard that, you're like your grandfather. And I never thought I was like my dad at all. And it wasn't because, like, it was more because I thought, I didn't know who my dad was so much. He went to work. I just didn't know him that well. I thought of him as like the opposite of me, like a quiet person, didn't want to be in the spotlight, you know, probably wasn't funny, even though people would say that about me too, and playing secondary role to my mother. And I'd be like, I'm not nothing like this, right? And then I got to know him, and at the beginning when I got to know him, I was like, man, I hope I'm like him, because, you know, like 10% like him. Hope I'm 10% like him, because he turned into a great storyteller who had he did all these things that I didn't know he did. And then when I watched him improve for 10 years until he died, which, you know, like, I always looked at Michael Jackson, and I was like, you know, every year he looked better. He had a better outfit, and he looked better. He was getting better. And then one time, man, it went the other way. And I was like, I think that's it for Michael Jackson. And that was long before he died. But with my dad, the arrow kept going up, 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 up until he passed away. He was at his best when he passed away. And I was, and I learned that I was a lot like him. And I guess I wanted to be more like him when I got closer to him, because I thought, well, wait a second, if I have it genetically and I was raised by him and now I spent 10 years with him, how hard could it be for me to be like him? And then, you know, I have my ranking, like...
I was going to ask you about that, because it reminded me of the Calvin and Hobbes that we spoke of the other week, how we both love Calvin, and Calvin takes the polls. He's got his poll, and his dad's always getting ranked in the poll. How would you rank your dad, and who is his competition?
Yeah, I mean, I always would say this, and people would say it's crazy, and, you know, I'm very spiritual. I wouldn't say I'm very religious, not a particular religion, but I have a lot of influences, you know, somewhat like the army that I have together. I do the same thing with the spiritualness, and I'm open to a lot of different things. And, you know, I look at the Dalai Lama, you know, big fan of Jesus Christ. And so I made a joke when my dad died, because, you know, we were involved with the Catholic religion, and my dad and mom went to church every Sunday, and they were Catholic, and I was an altar boy. So, you know, I similar to the way I talked about Chet, I don't feel like, I feel like I can talk about the Catholic religion because I was so entrenched in it, so it's not like I'm like,
right,
but don't know anything about it. But, you know, I wouldn't, like, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but there were certain things that we were, let's not say argue, let's say discussing about my dad's funeral. And I was like, look, I think we have to go with what he wanted, okay? His own words, what he wanted. Because to be honest, I rank him slightly above Jesus Christ and then the Dalai Lama. So that's my order. My dad, Jesus Christ, and the Dalai Lama. And the last thing I will say about my dad is it was sort of like, no matter, he saw the good in everybody, and it didn't matter who it was. You know, and me, you know, I come across people, I'm like, I don't know if I like that person. You know, he was never like that. And what happened was, the magical part of it was that whoever he met rose to the expectations that he had of the people. So he always looked at the best in people. He never brought out the worst. And you know, there's so many people, like I see it, you know, when people talk about their kids and they harp on what the kid did wrong. And eventually, it's taken me a long time, but my teaching methods, my dad was a great teacher, my teaching methods have changed to the point that, and he taught Six Sigma. He said there's a real philosophy that works in looking at people's strong points and ignoring the weak points. And so I thought, what am I doing teaching tennis, pointing out things people are doing wrong? Maybe I'll change.
Wow.
So it took me almost until he died for me to change. But
that's a great perspective.
But yeah, so he's another one that I have, that I can always say, you know, what would my dad do in a certain situation? And I have some, he's only been dead for a year. He's only been gone for a year. How do you say that? But I've had some challenging issues in the last year, not to mention this pandemic. And he, you know, I use him as a reference.
You know, Anthony, it's a very special person that as a boss can get people to want to work for them because of who they are. A lot of people are like, oh, I got to do this, and they're always griping about their superiors. And occasionally you will meet someone and work for someone, if you're lucky, who you're like, man, I really want to do a good job, because they lead by example, and you want to live up to that because they do see the best in you, and they are on your team, and you feel that they're in your corner, and they want you to shine as much as you can.
Well, my father, so I guess it was maybe like 8 years after my mother died, the team that he worked with at Johnson Matthey contacted him and brought him to lunch, and he told the story like he had no idea. Right? They, you know, he'd be saying, hey, Aunt. You know, my dad's name's Anthony too. That's why I like the junior. He said, hey, Aunt, you know, I was at the lunch, he goes, and it was really a nice time. And, you know, these guys said how much they enjoyed working for me, and how we had a team together. Like, he had no idea. and I just thought it just speaks to his character.
That's the beauty of his humility. Yeah,
that's what he was. Because and that's something like, I'm glad I have another 30 years left to try to get to that point, and I'm hoping and praying that I could become the kind of boss that he was. So, because I'm not so sure, you know, Betsy reminds me that I don't actually talk to my people like he might have talked to them. But,
well,
so I still have something to learn.
Yes, but you're also your own person, and I'm sure there were things about your methods that he held in high esteem.
Yeah,
so.
He does like he mentions my continual improvement, and he always points that out.
Right.
That I always want to get better, and always want to improve, and I want to continue to learn. And that's something I learned from him.
I will say this, that you were lucky to have not only all your influences, but, you know, great parents who supported you really through thick and thin, through the good stuff and the not so good stuff. And next week, we're going to touch a little bit on the maybe the not as good stuff with the law.
Oh yeah, that's funny that episode comes next.
But his parents were a constant, so that's the good thing.
Yeah, the next part of it will be more interesting. Thanks,
right.
Rosie.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.